My daughter accidentally forgot to hang up, and I heard she needs to go to a nursing home. I said nothing and silently sold the house for $990,000. Changed the will, but when she found out there would be no inheritance. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who sat alone in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, replaying a phone call over and over in her mind like a broken record. But that's exactly where I found myself on a Tuesday in October, with a cup of chamomile tea going cold on the table and my hands folded in my lap, very still, the way hands get when the rest of you is trying not to fall apart. Let me tell you how things were before all of this, because there was a before, and it mattered. My name is Margaret Callahan. Most people who love me call me Peggy. I'm 74 years old, and until that October evening, I believed I had done a reasonable job of building a life worth being proud of. My husband, Frank, passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless. And after the grief settled into something I could carry, I found that I actually liked living alone. Not in a bitter way, in a quiet, self-sufficient way that surprised even me. I kept a garden. I cooked real meals. I had my neighbor Dorothy over for cards on Thursdays, and every Sunday I drove myself to street. Michael's sat in the third pew from the left and felt something close to peace. My house on Clover Hill Road was paid off, had been for 15 years. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a backyard maple tree that Frank planted the year we moved in. The county assessor had it valued at $990,000 the previous spring, a number that still made me blink. We'd bought it for $62,000 in 1979. That's the kind of math that makes you understand what a lifetime looks like on paper. I had 2 children. My son, Robert, lived in Portland with his wife and their twin boys. We spoke every Sunday after church without fail. And then there was Diane. Diane was my daughter, 48 years old, married to a man named Todd Briggs, who sold commercial insurance and had the handshake of a man who needed you to trust him immediately. They lived 20 minutes away, in a newer development with a homeowners association and a community pool that nobody used after September. Diane came by once or twice a month, usually on Saturdays, usually with a casserole dish of something that reheated well. I appreciated the gesture. I always had. But I want to be honest now, the way you can only be honest after the fact. There had been signs. Small ones. The kind you explain away because the alternative explanation is too uncomfortable to sit with. It started, I think, the previous spring. Diane began asking questions about my finances with a frequency I hadn't noticed before. How was my pension holding up? Had I thought about whether the house was too much to maintain on my own? Wasn't the yard getting to be a lot of work? Each question on its own was reasonable. A daughter concerned about her aging mother. That's how I filed them, one by one, in the drawer of reasonable concerns. Then in August, she brought a brochure. She set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee cup, with a casualness that felt rehearsed. Sunrise Gardens Senior Living Community. Full-service amenities. Supervised care, structured activities. I looked at it. I said, "That's very nice, Diane." I didn't pick it up. She didn't push, but she left it there, and I noticed she didn't take it with her when she left. In September, Todd started coming along on the Saturday visits. He'd never done that before, not consistently. He would walk through the house with his hands in his pockets, pausing in doorways, looking up at the ceilings the way contractors do. Once I caught him standing in the backyard, just standing there, looking at the maple tree and the property line, and there was something in his expression I didn't have a name for yet. And then came the Tuesday in October. Diane had called at 7 in the evening. A normal call. She asked if I'd seen the doctor about my knee. I said I had an appointment next week. We talked about Robert's boys starting Little League. She said she had to go start dinner, and we said goodbye. And I heard the sound of a call ending, except it didn't end. I realized it after a moment of silence. The call was still connected. The phone hadn't hung up properly on her end. I could hear the ambient sounds of her kitchen, the clatter of a pan, and then Todd's voice, closer, asking how the call went. And I heard Diane say, clear as anything, same as always. She's fine, stubborn as ever. And Todd said something I couldn't quite make out. And then Diane said, and I have heard these words every night since. I have heard them in my sleep. She needs to go into a home, Todd. The sooner the better. That house isn't going to sell itself, and we are not waiting another 5 years. I sat very still. I did not hang up. I listened for another 40 seconds, long enough to hear Todd say, "What about Robert?" And Diane say, "Robert's in Portland. Robert doesn't need to know everything." Then the call ended. A real ending this time. I put the phone down on the table. I looked at my cold chamomile tea. I looked at my hands, and I thought, so that's what this has been. I didn't cry. I want to make that clear. Not because tears would have been weakness, but because there were no tears. Just a kind of cold, spreading clarity. The way a winter morning looks before the sun is fully up. Everything sharp. Everything still. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The maple tree in the backyard moved in the wind, just slightly, the way it always did. I'd looked at that tree from this window for 45 years. Frank had planted it as a sapling, barely taller than our Diane was at the time. And now Diane wanted to sell the land it stood on, and I was supposed to go quietly into a building with scheduled meal times and a cheerful activities coordinator and never come back. I thought about the brochure she'd left on my table. I thought about Todd in the backyard, his hands in his pockets. I thought about every question she'd asked me about money over the past 6 months. And I laid them out in my mind one by one, like evidence. Because that's what they were, weren't they? Not concern. Evidence. How long had this been the plan? I'm a practical woman. Frank used to say that about me, and he meant it as the highest compliment. While other people were still reacting, Peggy was already figuring out what to do next. Grief hadn't broken that in me, and neither would this. But I will admit, and I think honesty matters here, because if I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to tell it truthfully. I was afraid. Not the sharp, immediate kind of afraid. The slow, settling kind. The fear of being made helpless. The fear of being managed. The fear that at 74, in a legal and logistical world I didn't fully understand, my own daughter might be able to do exactly what she intended, and there might be very little I could do about it. Could she force me into a facility? I didn't know. I was in good health, mentally sound, living independently. But I'd heard enough stories. A doctor's opinion here, a legal filing there, a family member with power of attorney who decides the time has come. I had no idea what tools Diane might be gathering quietly, the way she'd been gathering everything else quietly. And the not knowing was its own kind of fear. I slept badly that night, and the next morning I did what practical women do. I made a list. Not a list of grievances, a list of questions. What did I actually own, and in what form? What was my legal standing? Who knew about my situation, and who could I trust? What would Diane's strategy likely be, and what were its weak points? I knew the house was mine, free and clear, in my name alone. Frank's name had come off the deed 8 years ago when we'd updated our estate planning after his diagnosis. The house was mine to sell, rent, gift, or leave to whoever I chose. Diane had no legal claim to it while I was living. That was one solid thing I could stand on. I also knew that my will, last updated 11 years ago when Frank was still alive, left the house equally to Diane and Robert, with the personal property divided the same way. A will made when I believed my children were equal partners in my life. Before I understood that one of them had been conducting a quiet audit of my assets and making plans that didn't include asking my opinion. I needed a lawyer, not the family attorney who'd handled Frank's estate. He was a friend of Todd's golf partner, a detail I now found deeply uncomfortable. I needed someone with no connection to Diane's world, someone I found on my own. I also needed to understand the house's actual market position. The county assessment was nearly $1 million. But what would it actually sell for? And how quickly? I wasn't thinking of selling yet, or I wasn't admitting it to myself yet. But I needed to understand what I held. I drove to the library that Thursday morning. Dorothy, my card-playing neighbor, asked if I wanted company, and I said no. I had some research to do. I used the library computer. I have my own laptop. But something made me want this particular search to happen somewhere other than my home network, and I'm not sure I could have explained exactly why, except that I was beginning to think carefully about what left traces. I searched for estate attorneys in the county. I wrote down 3 names, offices far enough from our neighborhood that I was unlikely to run into anyone I knew. I searched for real estate market values on Clover Hill Road. I found that 2 comparable properties had sold in the past 18 months. One for $980,000, one for just over $1 million. My house, in its current condition, would likely be competitive. I sat with that number for a while, and then, slowly, a thought began to take shape. Not a full plan yet. Just a direction. A first step that could become a second step that could become something Diane had not anticipated at all. What if I sold the house first? Not because I wanted to leave. I didn't want to leave. But what Diane was planning to do with my home was predicated on one assumption: that it would still be mine to inherit when I was gone. That I would go quietly into Sunrise Gardens and the house would sit, and eventually it would pass to her. But I was alive. I was mentally competent. I was the sole owner of a piece of property worth close to $1 million. And in the state of Ohio, a mentally competent adult can sell their own property to whoever they choose for whatever reason they choose. And they do not need their daughter's permission. I drove home from the library in the October light, the maple trees along the road all going gold and red. I thought about Frank. I thought about what he would have said. He would have said, "Peggy, don't get mad. Get organized." So I got organized. I called the first attorney on my list the following Monday morning. Her name was Patricia Oakes, and her office was in Worthington, a 30-minute drive, in a building with a parking garage where I felt reasonably sure Diane's friends wouldn't spot my car. I told the receptionist I needed to discuss estate planning and a potential property transaction. They gave me an appointment for Wednesday at 2 o'clock. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not Dorothy, not Robert. Not yet. Robert didn't know any of this was happening, and I needed to understand the full picture before I involved him. He had a good relationship with Diane, or believed he did, and I didn't want to say things that couldn't be unsaid until I was certain of what I was dealing with. The drive to Worthington on Wednesday was pleasant. One of those Ohio autumn days that makes you forgive the state for February. I found the office, found parking, and sat in the waiting room with a magazine I didn't read. Patricia Oakes turned out to be a woman in her early 60s, compact and calm, with the particular manner of someone who has spent decades listening to families describe their complications without surprise or judgment. I liked her immediately. I told her everything: the phone call, the brochure, Todd in the backyard, the questions about money. I told it all in order, the way I'd organized it in my head, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Callahan, you are in a strong legal position. You are competent, healthy, and the sole owner of your property. No one can compel you to move, sell, or alter your estate without your consent." She paused. "The concern I would flag is a future guardianship or conservatorship filing. If a family member petitions the court claiming you lack the capacity to manage your own affairs, that process can be difficult, even when the claim is entirely without merit." "How do I protect myself from that?" I asked. "Documentation," she said. "A current cognitive evaluation from your physician, a clearly stated and witnessed expression of your wishes, and, if you're considering selling the property, doing so promptly through proper channels removes the primary asset from the equation." We talked for an hour and a half. Before I left, I had retained her officially. I'd written a check. She was my attorney. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt since October, a sense of solid ground. Now, the direct evidence. It came, as these things often do, from an unexpected direction. The following Saturday, Diane came by as usual. She brought a pan of lasagna and seemed, to my eyes, to be watching me more carefully than before. I had made a decision to behave exactly as I always did. I offered coffee. I asked about her week. I admired the lasagna. I was the same Peggy I had always been on Saturday afternoons, and if anything, I may have been slightly warmer because I was aware of the performance and could control it. She used the bathroom while she was there. She was gone for perhaps 5 minutes. A little long, I thought, but I said nothing. After she left, I went upstairs. My bedroom door, which I habitually leave open, was pulled mostly closed. Not latched, but nearly so. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went in. My desk drawer was not quite closed. I keep it fully closed. I am a tidy person, by habit. Inside the drawer I keep, among other things, my current bank statements and the folder where I store documents related to the house, the deed, the tax records, the insurance policy. I looked through them carefully. Everything was there. But the insurance policy was facing the wrong direction. I keep the labeled tab facing out, and it was now facing in. She'd been through my papers. I stood very still, holding the insurance folder, and I thought about what that meant. She wasn't just talking to Todd about her plans. She was actively investigating, looking for account numbers, property values, the name of my insurance carrier. Information you'd want if you were laying the groundwork for a legal move. A competency filing, perhaps. Or simply building the case that she knew the full picture of my estate. Was this woman, my daughter, actually cataloging my assets without my knowledge in my own bedroom while I sat downstairs making her coffee? Apparently she was. I took out my phone and photographed the drawer as it was. Then I photographed the insurance folder. Then I put everything back exactly as Diane had left it, so she would have no reason to know I'd noticed. I sent the photographs to Patricia Oakes with a text message that said, "I believe my daughter searched my papers during a visit today. Is this relevant?" Patricia replied within the hour. "Document everything. Date, time, what was disturbed. This pattern of behavior will be relevant if she pursues any legal action. You are doing exactly the right thing." I made dinner that evening. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd heard the phone call that started all of this, and I ate my soup, and I looked out the window at the dark backyard where the maple tree was just a shape in the darkness. There was no more question of whether this was really happening. It was happening. And I had already taken the first steps to make sure it happened on my terms, not hers. I listed the house in the first week of November. Patricia had connected me with a real estate agent she trusted, a woman named Claudia Marsh, who worked out of an office in Dublin and had a reputation for discretion and fast closings. I met with Claudia twice before signing anything. I told her I wanted to sell quietly, without yard signs or open houses that would advertise the listing to the neighborhood and to my daughter. Claudia said that was more common than I might think, and that in the current market, for a property like mine, she expected multiple offers within 2 weeks. She was right. The listing went up on a Tuesday. By the following Friday, I had 4 offers, all within range of the asking price. One offer, from a family relocating from Columbus, came in at $990,000, cash, with a 45-day close. No contingencies. I took it. I signed the purchase agreement on a Thursday morning in Claudia's office. I felt, sitting there with the pen in my hand, the particular stillness of a person doing something irrevocable and knowing it. I signed anyway. Frank would have said I was being decisive. I signed. The day after the agreement was signed, I went back to Patricia's office and we rewrote my will entirely. Robert would receive the liquid assets from the house sale, held in a new account Diane had no knowledge of, plus my personal property. I established a small charitable bequest to St. Michael's. For Diane, I left a single line. To my daughter, Diane Briggs, I leave the sum of $1, reflecting my full awareness of her intentions and my deliberate choice. Patricia reviewed the language carefully to ensure it was unambiguous and would withstand a challenge. It would. I left her office that afternoon and drove to Dorothy's house and had tea, and I didn't tell Dorothy any of it, but I sat in her warm kitchen and listened to her talk about her grandchildren, and I felt almost like a normal person for an hour. Then on the second Saturday of November, Diane came to visit, and I knew the moment she walked in that something had changed. She was too composed. Todd was with her, which he wasn't always, and he had the quality of a man who has prepared what he wants to say. They sat at my kitchen table. My kitchen table, for what I now knew were only a few more weeks, and Diane put her hands flat on the surface and said, "Mom, we need to talk about the house." I looked at her. I said, "All right." She said she'd heard from a woman in her book club whose neighbor used Claudia Marsh that my house had been listed. She said she'd looked it up. She said she wanted to understand what was happening. I told her very calmly that I had sold the house, that the agreement was signed, that I was moving. The silence that followed was one of the longer silences of my adult life. Then Todd spoke. He said that he thought I might not understand the full implications of what I was doing, that selling a property of this value had tax consequences I should be aware of, that he was concerned, and here his voice took on a particular quality, careful and layered, that someone might have influenced me to make this decision, that perhaps I should speak to a doctor before proceeding. There it was. The word doctor placed very specifically, like a piece on a chessboard. I looked at Todd for a long moment. Then I said, "I have a real estate attorney, a tax advisor, and a physician who has documented my full cognitive health. The sale is legal, complete, and not subject to interference." Diane's face changed. The composed look fell away, and what was underneath it was not grief, and it was not concern, and it was not the face of a daughter who loved her mother. It was fury. She said, and her voice shook, "You had no right to do this without consulting me. This affects our family. This affects our future." "Your future," I said, "not mine." Todd said something about contesting the sale. I told him that Patricia Oakes of Oakes and Associates in Worthington had the file, and he was welcome to have his attorney contact her. I slid Patricia's card across the table. It had been sitting in my cardigan pocket for exactly this moment. They left 20 minutes later. Todd was still talking as they went down the porch steps, his voice low and controlled. Diane said nothing further. The door closed. I sat down. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the physical effort of having been completely still while everything in me wanted to shake. I breathed carefully until they stopped. Then I called Patricia and reported the conversation in detail. She said, "They won't contest the sale. There's no legal basis, but get ready for escalation." I knew she was right, and for that reason, I gave myself 4 days of deliberate rest. I went to Dorothy's for dinner. I attended Sunday Mass. I sat on the porch in the November cold and watched the maple tree losing its last leaves and tried to store the image, knowing I wouldn't have many more mornings here. I was tired, but I was not defeated. And those are not the same thing at all. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 10 days after the confrontation in my kitchen. Diane. Her voice was different this time. Softer. The anger smoothed over with something that was meant to sound like remorse. She said she'd been thinking. She said she and Todd had reacted badly, and she wanted to apologize for that. She said that what she really wanted, underneath everything, was to make sure I was taken care of. She said maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe she'd said some things that didn't come out right, and that she hoped we could sit down together and talk about what the future could look like for our family. I listened to all of this. I let her finish completely. Then I said, "What is it you're proposing, Diane?" She said, and the offer came out quickly, which told me it had been prepared, that if I called off the sale, she and Todd were prepared to move into the house with me. We could share it. She could help with the maintenance, be there if I needed anything. We could be a family again. I wouldn't be alone. Could she hear herself? Did she understand what she was offering and what it revealed? She was offering to move into my home, the home she had planned to sell, as though this were a gift to me rather than a continuation of the exact same strategy by a different route. I would be living in my own house as a guest, and Todd would be in the backyard again, hands in his pockets, waiting. I said, "That's very kind, Diane. I'll think about it." I would not be thinking about it. After we hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my lap, and I felt the very particular calm of a person who is no longer surprised by anything. The anger that had lived in my chest since October had burned down to something clean and cold, like an ember that's past the stage where it needs oxygen. It didn't need anything now. It simply was. The closing on the house was set for 3 weeks out. I had already arranged, quietly and on my own, to rent a condominium in a newer building near Worthington, close to Patricia's office, as it happened, which struck me as appropriate. 2 bedrooms, a balcony, a gym I would probably not use, and the profound luxury of living in a place that nobody in my family had ever expected me to want. I began packing, slowly and with intention, the way you pack when you are choosing what your life will contain going forward. Books I'd carried for 50 years. Frank's watch, which I kept in my nightstand. The photograph of Robert and Diane taken at the lake the summer she was 14 and he was 10, before she became whoever she had become, when I still believed I knew what she was. I kept that photograph. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because the girl in it wasn't lying yet. It was Dorothy who became my social ground during this time. I told her, finally, the full story. From the phone call to the sale to the conversation at the kitchen table to Diane's offer. This week. Dorothy listened with her hands wrapped around her mug, her expression moving through a range of reactions she was too polite to voice fully. At the end, she said, "Peggy, good God." "I know," I said. "And Robert?" This was the question I hadn't fully answered yet. I needed to tell Robert. It was becoming urgent. The closing was 3 weeks away, and he was still in Portland with no idea that his mother had sold the house he grew up in and cut his sister out of the will. He deserved to know, and I needed someone in my family to know, someone I could trust. I called him the next Sunday after church. I asked if he had some time to talk. He said, of course. I told him everything from the beginning, the same way I'd told Patricia, the same way I'd told Dorothy, the careful linear order of a woman who knows that details matter. He was quiet for a very long time after I finished. Then he said, Mom, why didn't you call me sooner? I needed to have the pieces in order first, I said. I didn't want to alarm you without knowing what I was dealing with. Another pause. Then, is there anything you need me to do? I said, not yet, but I may need you to come to Ohio before the end of the year. I'll be there, he said, no hesitation. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for 3 more weeks. And I breathed, and the tightness that had been in my chest since October loosened just slightly. Not because the situation had changed, but because I was no longer holding it alone. Diane and Todd, I was told later by a mutual acquaintance, had consulted an attorney of their own. The attorney had apparently told them what Patricia had told me. The sale was solid, the documentation was clean, and there was no legal mechanism to stop it short of proving incompetence in a court proceeding, which, given my documented cognitive health, was not going to go anywhere good for them. They were watching, waiting to see if I would waver. I didn't waver. They came on a Friday afternoon, 9 days before the closing. I saw Todd's car in the driveway from the upstairs window, where I was sorting through the last of the linen closet. They hadn't called ahead. That told me something. People who want a genuine conversation call ahead. People who want to catch you off balance arrive without warning. I came downstairs, opened the door, and said, "Come in." Diane was carrying flowers. Dahlias from a grocery store, wrapped in cellophane. She held them out with an expression that I recognized from when she was 9 years old and had broken something and was trying to manage the fallout. Todd was dressed more carefully than he usually was for a casual visit. These were costumes. I took the flowers, thanked her, and put them in water. And we sat in the living room among my half-packed boxes. Diane looked at the boxes. I watched her look at them. I said nothing. She began the way she'd begun on the phone. Softly, with words about family and worry and her only wanting what was best. She said she'd been losing sleep. She said that if she had given the wrong impression, she was truly sorry. She said she missed her mother. I looked at her, and I thought of that telephone call in October, the one where she'd forgotten to hang up. The clarity of her voice when she'd said she needs to go into a home. The particular business-like efficiency of a woman who had already made her decision and was simply discussing the logistics. You can paper over a lot of things with dahlias and a soft voice. You cannot paper over that, I said. I appreciate you saying that, Diane. Todd leaned forward then. He said he wanted to talk practically, one adult to another. He said that phrase specifically, one adult to another, as if the question of whether I qualified had not already been raised implicitly by his earlier suggestion that I see a doctor. He said that the sale, while legally valid, had taken everyone by surprise. He said that the family, he used the word family, as though he were its appointed representative, deserved some input into a decision of this magnitude. I asked him what input he felt he should have had. He said carefully that a property like mine, sold quickly and without proper consultation, was unlikely to achieve full market value. He said he happened to know that the buyers I'd accepted were getting an exceptional deal. He said that if I were willing to terminate the agreement, He said terminate the agreement like a man who'd spent time with a lawyer. There was an investor he knew personally who would offer more. More money. A better outcome for everyone. More money. For everyone. Who was everyone? Todd, I said. The sale price was $990,000, cash, no contingencies. What figure is your investor proposing? He named a number. It was $30,000 higher. I said, and who would be handling the proceeds from that sale? A pause. Just a beat, but I'd been watching his face, and it was the pause of a man recalibrating. He said I would, of course, with the support of people who had my best interests at heart. The support of people who have my best interests at heart, I repeated. Diane's expression shifted then. A tightening around the eyes, the composure fraying. She said, Mom, we are trying to help you. We are trying to make sure you aren't taken advantage of. You are 74 years old and you sold your house in 3 weeks without telling your own family. Does that seem rational to you? Does that seem like something a person does when they are fully? She stopped, but the word was there, hanging in the room. Fully. Fully what, Diane? I let the silence stand for a moment. Then I said, I want to be very careful about where this conversation is going. She said she wasn't implying anything. She said she was worried. Her voice had gone somewhere between angry and something that might have been practiced emotion. I could not tell anymore where the performance ended and the real person began, or whether there was still a real person I would recognize. I stood up. I said, I think we've said what needs to be said for today. My closing is in 9 days. My attorney is Patricia Oakes in Worthington, and her number is on the card I gave Todd last time. If there's anything further to discuss, that's the channel. They left. Todd with his jaw set. Diane with the particular rigid posture of a woman holding fury in with a great deal of effort. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my back to it. And then, for the first time since October, I felt genuine fear. Not the cold, analytical fear of those early nights. Something more immediate. They had as good as questioned my competence directly in my own living room. Fully. She hadn't said the word, but she'd aimed it, and we both knew where it was pointing. A court filing, a petition, a judge deciding whether Peggy Callahan could be trusted to manage her own affairs. I stood in the hallway for a long time, and then the fear did something unexpected. It gathered itself up and turned into something hard and certain in the center of my chest. I had 9 days. The closing would happen, and when it did, there would be nothing left to petition over. No house, no illusion that Diane had any particular claim on my future. Just money in an account, and a will that said what I meant, and a woman who had looked her daughter in the eye and not given an inch. I was afraid, yes, but I had never been more certain. I closed on the house on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Claudia was there, and Patricia and the buyers. The family from Columbus, the father with a handshake like Frank's, and 2 daughters who were going to grow up with that maple tree in the backyard. And I was glad about that. I was genuinely glad. And I signed my name to the documents with a steady hand and walked out into the November morning holding a folder of paperwork and the largest check I had ever seen. Robert had arrived the night before. I'd picked him up from the airport myself, refused his offer to hire a car, and we'd sat up late in the kitchen of the condo I'd been renting for the past 11 days, and I'd told him the parts of the story I hadn't yet told by phone. He sat across from me with his coffee, very still, with Frank's way of listening that I've always loved in him. And when I finished, he said, I want to be there when you tell Diane. I said, I was hoping you'd say that. I had invited Diane and Todd to the condo the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Diane thought she was coming to discuss, in her mind presumably, There were still terms to negotiate, still some version of the future where she came out of this with what she'd intended. She arrived thinking she had leverage. That was important. We sat in the living room. Robert on the small sofa near the window, me in the armchair. Diane and Todd on the 2 chairs I'd arranged on the other side of the coffee table. It was late afternoon, gray outside, the bare branch light of late November. I set a copy of the signed closing documents on the coffee table. I set a copy of the revised will beside it. Diane looked at both and said nothing. I said, "The house sold. The closing was Tuesday. I wanted to have this conversation in person with Robert present." Todd said, "We know about the closing." His voice was controlled. "We're here because there are family decisions that still need to be made," Robert said. "What family decisions are those?" Todd glanced at him. Something shifted in his approach. He hadn't expected Robert to be here, and Robert's tone, which was pleasant and entirely without deference, seemed to recalibrate something in his strategy. He said, "The disposition of your mother's estate involves all of you." "Actually," I said, "it involves me, and I've made my decisions." Diane said, "Mom," I said, "let me finish." And something in my voice, the particular quality of a voice that has finished waiting, made her stop. I told them about the will. Not the full language, but the structure. Robert as primary beneficiary of the proceeds, the charitable bequest, and Diane's bequest. I said the last part clearly and without softening it. The silence after was of a completely different quality than any silence that had come before. Diane said, "That's not serious." I said, "Patricia Oakes drafted it. It has been witnessed and filed. It is entirely serious." She said, "You can't do this." Her voice had changed, gone thin, the way voices go when the mechanism of self-control has been strained past its capacity. "You're punishing me over a conversation." "A conversation," I said, "where you told your husband the house wasn't going to sell itself, and you weren't waiting another 5 years." "Yes." The color left her face. Todd stood up. He said, "This is actionable. A will drawn up under whatever this is." He waved his hand at the room in a gesture that seemed to mean your advanced age, your obvious instability, this whole situation. "We will challenge this," Robert said. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that she's being manipulated," Todd said. "By an attorney, by—" He stopped. "By whom?" Robert asked. He sounded genuinely curious. Todd had no answer to that, because the answer was nobody. I had sold my own house and changed my own will and retained my own attorney, and I had done all of it while Diane was bringing casseroles and searching my desk drawers, and there was not a manipulator anywhere in the picture except the 2 people sitting across the coffee table. Diane began to cry. Whether they were real tears or strategic ones, I couldn't tell anymore, and I realized I had stopped trying to tell the difference. She said that she'd only been trying to plan for the future, that she'd been frightened about what would happen to me, that I had never understood how much pressure she and Todd were under, the mortgage, the debt she'd never fully told me about, the years of financial stress. She was telling me their debts were the reason my house was supposed to be their solution. She was telling me this as though it were a mitigating factor. I looked at my daughter for a long time. I thought of the girl in the photograph, 14 years old at the lake, squinting into the sun. I thought of the woman who had brought the Sunrise Gardens brochure and left it on my table like a quiet declaration. And I said, with the calmness of someone who has been preparing to say a thing for a long time, "Diane, I love you, but I am not responsible for your debts. I am not a solution to a financial problem. I am your mother, and I was worth more than that, and I think somewhere underneath all of this you already know it." She had no answer for that either. Todd stood. Diane gathered herself, stood. They left without saying goodbye. Robert and I sat in the quiet living room. Outside, it was getting dark. After a while, he said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it. Then I said, "Yes, I actually am." As Patricia had predicted, Todd and Diane retained an attorney in December. I know this because Patricia received the initial correspondence just before Christmas. A letter from a firm in Columbus suggesting, in the formal language of people who are preparing a fight they don't entirely believe in, that the will had been executed under undue influence and that my competency at the time of signing should be evaluated. Patricia's reply, which I read before she sent it, was 3 pages long. It included the report from my physician, Dr. Hannah Wexler, who had been my doctor for 19 years and whose documentation of my cognitive health was thorough and contemporaneous. It included the timeline of my decisions, all of them independently made and verifiable. It included, as an attachment, the photographs I had taken of my desk drawer after Diane's visit in October, with the date and timestamp. The Columbus firm did not respond with a filing. They responded 2 weeks later with a 2-paragraph letter declining to proceed. I read that letter at my kitchen table in the condo. My kitchen table now, the one I'd bought second-hand at an estate sale on Worthington's main street, small and round and nothing like the old table on Clover Hill Road. I read it twice. Then I set it down and had my coffee. Diane called in January. I let it go to voicemail. She called again in February. I let that go to voicemail also. The messages were variations on a theme. She wanted to talk. She was hurt. She hoped I understood that she'd acted out of love. She wanted to repair the relationship. I listened to each message fully, which is more than I was obligated to do. I did not return the calls. This was not, I want to be clear, a decision made in anger. I had passed through anger some time ago. This was a decision made in the same clear-headed way I had made all the others, by considering what I actually wanted and needed in my life and acting accordingly. What I had no use for was an ongoing relationship governed by the permanent uncertainty of not knowing when the next audit would come, the next brochure on the table, the next carefully placed suggestion that I was not quite capable of managing my own affairs. I was capable. I had sold a house for $990,000, retained 2 attorneys and a financial advisor, changed my will, moved to a new home, and navigated a sustained campaign of manipulation by a person who had underestimated me. My competency was not in question. Robert came back for a long weekend in March. We went to the Botanical Garden, which was doing a winter orchid exhibition, and ate lunch at a restaurant where the waiter knew his name. He'd apparently been there the week before for a conference. We talked about the twins, and about Frank, and about what my next year might look like. I told him I was thinking about traveling. He said he thought that was an excellent idea. He didn't mention Diane, and neither did I. The legal situation settled finally, in spring. Patricia informed me that the will stood as written and that there were no further challenges pending. The estate, when the time came, and that time could be 20 years away because I intended to take good care of myself, would be distributed as I had directed. Robert, St. Michael's, and $1 to the woman who had taught me, late in life, the difference between a daughter and a person who was waiting for an inheritance. Patricia also told me something else, quietly, over the phone. She'd heard from a colleague that Todd and Diane were dealing with significant financial difficulty. The debt Diane had mentioned in the living room that November afternoon had apparently been more serious than a passing comment suggested. They were in the process of refinancing their house. The investment Todd had been waiting to deploy, presumably involving my property, had not materialized. I absorbed this information. I didn't feel satisfaction, or I didn't feel only satisfaction. I felt the complicated, uncomfortable feeling of watching a plan collapse on the people who made it, knowing that some of the collapse was of their own making and some of it was consequence, and those are not always easy to separate. But I did not intervene. I had not taken any action against them. I had only declined to be their solution. What came after that was theirs. The house on Clover Hill Road, I heard through Claudia, was settling into its new life. The Columbus family had painted the front door red. The maple tree was there, just as it had always been, and in spring it would go green again. Some things don't need you to be watching to keep going. Spring in Worthington turned out to be something I hadn't expected. Beautiful. I know that sounds like a small thing. But there's a difference between living somewhere because you've always lived there and choosing a place as an adult, with intention, because it suits the life you want. The condo complex had a courtyard with raised flower beds, and I'd claimed one of them from the building manager in April and planted sweet peas and dahlias. The irony of the dahlias was not lost on me. And by June, I had more flowers than I knew what to do with, and was bringing them to the nurses' station at the medical building down the street, who seemed genuinely pleased each time. I joined a book club, not the kind with wine and no books, the kind with both, as it turned out, which seemed to me the optimal arrangement. There were 7 women, ranging in age from 52 to 81, and the 81-year-old, whose name was Vera, and who had survived a genuinely eventful life, became my particular friend. She had a way of responding to stories of human disappointment by saying, "Well, of course," which I found deeply comforting. When I told her my story, she said exactly that, and poured more wine, and that was somehow exactly right. I booked a trip to Portugal for September. Frank had always meant for us to go, and then the years had arranged themselves otherwise, and then he was gone. I booked it myself, through an actual travel agent, stayed 11 days in Lisbon, took a train to Porto, and walked more than I would have believed my knee would allow. I came home with a linen jacket and 2 bottles of wine, and a sense of myself as a person who was still, at 74, capable of doing things for the first time. Dorothy came to visit in October. We walked along the Olentangy Trail and had lunch, and she mentioned that the house on Clover Hill Road had new rose bushes along the front fence, which I thought Frank would have liked. Robert called every Sunday. The twins were playing baseball. He said carefully once that Diane had reached out to him, and I said I understood, and I didn't ask him to choose sides because I never had. As for Diane and Todd, their financial situation had become more difficult than even the December rumor had suggested. They'd been unable to sustain the mortgage on their development house and had, by summer, moved into a rental. Todd's position at his firm had changed after a restructuring. I didn't know the specifics, and I didn't seek them out. I heard, through a woman at church, that Diane spoke of me rarely, and when she did, it was with a brittleness that made people change the subject. Whether things would improve for her, I genuinely didn't know. I thought about her sometimes. I thought about the photograph I'd kept, the one of her and Robert at the lake, the summer she was 14. I still had it, in a frame on the bookshelf. I had not moved it. What I had come to understand, slowly and without bitterness, was that Diane had been afraid too, not in ways that excused what she'd done. Fear doesn't excuse planning to dispossess your mother while bringing her lasagna. But fear was there underneath. Fear about money. Fear about the future. She had underestimated me, and I think she had underestimated herself. Somewhere in her calculus had been the assumption that taking from me was easier than building something for herself, and that assumption had proved catastrophically wrong. My life, meanwhile, kept exceeding its own expectations. I took a watercolor class at the community center, which I turned out to be mediocre at and enjoyed enormously. I became a regular at a breakfast spot near the condo, where the cook knew to bring my coffee before I ordered. I had dinner with Patricia twice. First professionally, then because we found the same things funny. I did not miss being managed. I did not miss the uncertainty of Diane's visits. I missed Frank. I always miss Frank. But that's a different kind of missing. The clean, permanent kind that lives alongside everything else without taking anything away. On a Sunday in November, almost exactly a year after the closing, I sat on my balcony in a sweater and watched the street below. Families walking dogs, a child on a bicycle, the sky that particular shade of late autumn blue that only happens for a few weeks and then is gone. I had $1 in my will and 990,000 reasons for it, and I was sitting on a balcony I'd chosen for myself, in a life I'd built from the wreckage of a betrayal. I was happy, genuinely, quietly, irreversibly happy. That's not a small thing either. If there's anything this year taught me, it's this. Being old doesn't mean being finished. It means you've had long enough to know the difference between people who love you and people who are waiting. I was lucky. I heard the call. Not everyone does. To anyone listening who has felt that chill, that first moment of wondering whether the people around you see you or see what you leave behind, trust that feeling. Then act. Get a real attorney. Document everything. Call the child who actually shows up, and never, never mistake someone's plans for your future with care about your present. Would you have done what I did? Would you have had the nerve to sell the house, change the will, and sit across from your own daughter without flinching? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment or share it with someone who might need to hear it. And thank you, truly, for listening to an old woman who refused to be managed.